Hey guys, welcome to Module 4. This week's short module lecture, I just want to highlight a little bit about our writing assignment this week, um, in which we're going to be looking at the issue of sanctuary cities and the issues associated with sanctuary cities and, for that matter, sanctuary states as it relates to law enforcement and courts. And so I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about this. And then I will also talk about the assignment itself. I hope to get it done in this video. If not, I will make a second video. So this week you have a couple of resources to read. One of those is a news article which highlights Senate Bill 4, which was passed by the Texas State Legislature, and basically banned sanctuary cities within the state of Texas. And so the article talks about the impact of that law on law enforcement, especially those law enforcement officers who happen to work in sanctuary cities. And ultimately, we'll talk a little bit about the courts that were involved, not just in this process, but the whole idea of how laws dealing with sanctuary cities might impact not just the local law enforcement, but the local courts as well. So again, the focus here is going to be on the issues of illegal immigration in the criminal justice system as based on the article. And then you have that short video which highlights sort of like a cops episode, except this is with immigration, customs enforcement, and their perspective on the need to enforce immigration laws, especially when you're dealing with illegal immigrants who are engaged in criminal activity or have been convicted of a crime, right? And then the impact that sanctuary cities and sanctuary states have on their ability to more judiciously apprehend those individuals. So the criminal justice system is affected directly or indirectly by nearly every public crime and policy issue that is raised. And immigration and sanctuary laws are no different. The only way I can describe it is it's just a big mess. Why is it a big mess? While you have some states are passing laws to undermine federal law, and then you have, for example, the state of Texas, which is passing laws to support federal law dealing with immigration issues. You have local municipalities that are passing laws to undermine state laws, and then you have the federal government is threatening those who violate federal laws, and the states are suing the federal government. So as you can see, it's a big mess. So we're just going to try to make a little bit better sense of what's going on, but I think it's important to understand, first from a law enforcement perspective, the impact, if any, that sanctuary states or sanctuary cities might have on law enforcement. Now, like some of the other topics we had, like the death penalty, for example, that we discussed last module, this is going to be one of them things that you probably either are for sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, or you don't support it. It just seems to be one of those social or public policy issues that there's not a whole lot of in-between feelings on some of these things. So law enforcement. So police chiefs across the country, and this is information from PERF, which is Police Executive Research Forum, support sanctuary cities because they believe it keeps crime down. Undocumented immigrants support law enforcement efforts by helping law enforcement and courts. In other words, they serve as victims and witnesses. So an important part here is the fact that whether you're a legal immigrant or an illegal immigrant or undocumented immigrant, you may very well be a victim of a crime. And in order for local law enforcement, at least, to investigate and properly apprehend someone who commits those crimes, we need people, we need witnesses to tell us what happened, we need victims to come forward. And this is something that's not new. I would tell you that right now. In the 1980s, I was working armed robbery cases, and remember, I'm from Southern California originally. Our community was heavily populated by Hispanics, and we knew we had more than our fair share, probably, undocumented immigrants. And what we began seeing, for example, is our local Hispanic gang members were robbing undocumented immigrants, confronting them on the street, robbing them at bars, with the idea that these guys probably aren't going to go to the cops anyhow because they're here illegally, and this just is going to make their life that much more difficult. And even prior to that, our city, the police chief at the time, we pretty much didn't enforce immigration as people think that cops do in non-sanctuary locations. If somebody commits a crime or they're a victim of a crime, whether they're documented or undocumented, I'm telling you, local cops really don't care unless they're the ones breaking the law. And then they'll arrest you, investigate the crime, and charges go forward. And then, what happens later on down the road happens later on down the road. So this whole idea of the need for local law enforcement to build that relationship with that segment of the community is important, especially if you have a significant section of your population that you believe is undocumented. Another example here is LAPD has had a policy prohibiting police from engaging in law enforcement activities based solely on a person's immigration status since 1979. And that's about the time the city I worked for, we pretty much had the same type of policy. And so it really was never, I don't think, ever an issue. We investigated crimes, we interviewed people, and we really didn't care of one's immigration status. Of course, unless you broke the law, and then others might be more interested in your immigration status. So the term sanctuary city doesn't mean an undocumented immigrants who commit crimes get a pass. Again, if you commit a crime, it's going to be investigated whether you're documented or undocumented, and if there's probable cause to make an arrest, you go to jail. So development of trust and cooperation that's been developed with undocumented immigrants has resulted in police being more effective at identifying, arresting, and prosecuting dangerous offenders who otherwise might still be on the street victimizing residents, both citizens and undocumented immigrants. And so this is also important for the courts. So the prosecutor is going to have witnesses, and the prosecutor needs to be sure that the witnesses are going to show up and testify. And so the witnesses, especially if they're undocumented, need to understand that you're not going to be deported. We need you to come to court and identify the offender and or just tell us what you saw so that you can be a good witness. The current system of enforcement is logical division of labor in which all parties know what is expected of them. And when I'm talking about division of labor, I'm talking about division of labor between the state and local police, state and local police agencies and the federal government. Federal agencies enforce federal statutes. That's jurisdiction, right? So immigration, custom enforcement, those are federal officers who enforce federal law, right? Local police, we don't really have federal authority to enforce federal statute. That's a federal crime. And so that's a common argument amongst those who support sanctuary cities and sanctuary states, is that that's a federal responsibility. It's not a state responsibility. It's not a local government responsibility. And local police agencies enforce state and local criminal laws. So that's how our system of government is set up, right? We talked about that early. We have the federal courts and we have federal law enforcement. In earlier chapters, you read about the different array of federal law enforcement agencies, and then you read about state law enforcement agencies. We have the counties and the county sheriff, and then we have local jurisdictions. These roles are compatible and complementary. In other words, we work together when we have to. For example, I worked with many federal agencies when I was working robberies, because if a bank got robbed in town, it's a state crime as well, because robbery is a state crime. But it's also a federal crime because, especially if the bank is FDIC insured, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. So if the bank is insured, and most banks are, and so it automatically became a federal crime as well. But odds are, my experience has been that in terms of bank robberies, that your offenders are pretty much local people. And so I've worked with them. And so it's compatible and complementary. We work together, and then eventually it's up to usually the federal government if they want to take the case or adopt the case. If not, then it's prosecuted at the local level. Local police have their hands full with crime, and when police identify a suspect in a probable cause, they make an arrest without regard to immigration status. That's pretty much what I told you already. Police chiefs' concern if agencies take a more active role in immigration law is that it'll hurt their ability to investigate and solve crimes in their communities. Without information from the community, investigating crime becomes difficult and crime levels will rise. So, sanctuary cities, is it a misnomer? What I'm saying, what I mean by this is that if you are an undocumented immigrant and you commit a crime, you're going to be punished for it. You're going to be arrested. You're going to be charged. The court's going to go through its things, and you'll end up going to jail if you're convicted or whatever the case may be. All right. So that's the issue: is sanctuary cities, sanctuary states. Is it truly a sanctuary? So the idea of it being a misnomer. Others argue sanctuary cities and states make cities and states less safe. Local police can't share information with federal agents, and maybe vice versa. Right? Especially when it comes to releasing of people from county jail, the use of a detainer. A detainer is not the same as a warrant, and so that's where some local sheriffs have an issue, is that once a person is eligible to be released, if they hold the person beyond the release date on a detainer, then they're afraid they may end up getting sued, a Fourth Amendment violation for unlawful seizure. So I'm just sharing that information with you so you have some ideas to what some of the legal arguments are. Our book talks about the case of Juan Francisco Lopez Sanchez. That's the undocumented immigrant from San Francisco that somehow ended up with a gun on one of the piers in San Francisco. He alleges that it fell, discharged, and it struck somebody and killed him. So that's on page 431. So, you know, unfortunately, this guy was a poster child for why sanctuary cities are not safe, but there's arguments on both sides of that. So let's look at police and courts real quick, and we need to look at it from the jurisdiction and function, right? And you've already researched federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, right? So federal law enforcement agencies such as the FBI, Immigration, Customs Enforcement, Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearm, ATF, DEA, Drug Enforcement Administration. That's at the federal level. And federal level and federal law has its own standards, all right? So not every case, for example, narcotics cases, not every case is going to get federally adopted. Usually they have specific criteria and guidelines. So if you got a really big drug dealer, they're interested. Otherwise, it's going to stay at the state and local level. So state law enforcement, again, we talked about state police, highway patrol. A lot of times there's like Georgia Bureau of Investigation or whatever. Those are going to be found at the state level. And then you have local, which is your local police and county sheriff, right? So their jurisdiction is going to be limited. Again, local and state law enforcement agencies have authority to enforce local and state laws, right? They do not have the authority to enforce federal law. And neither do federal agents have the right to enforce state and local law because they don't have jurisdiction. All right, so when we talk about the courts, we can argue the same thing. All right, so I'm going to take a break here. When I come back, we'll talk about the courts. And we'll finish up this little segment, and then I'll talk a little bit about the assignment specifically in just a few minutes. Okay, so I'll see you guys in just a second. Thank you.